The words hit me like a slap across the face, delivered with a smile that could have sold toothpaste. This is my lazy, chubby mother-in-law who's never worked a day in her life. Jessica's voice carried across the upscale restaurant with the confident cruelty of someone who believed she held all the cards. The table of 8 fell silent for exactly 3 seconds before erupting into the kind of laughter that makes your skin crawl. Not genuine amusement, but the performative mockery that passes for wit among people who mistake cruelty for cleverness. I sat frozen in my chair, fork halfway to my mouth, watching my son Brian's face cycle through embarrassment, resignation, and something that looked suspiciously like relief. Relief that his fiancée had finally said out loud what he'd apparently been thinking all along. "Oh my God, Jessica, you're terrible," squealed her maid of honor, a bottle blonde named Brittany whose voice could shatter crystal. But honestly, it's so refreshing to meet someone who actually says what everyone's thinking. What everyone's thinking. I set down my fork and looked around the table at the faces of people I'd never met before tonight. Jessica's family, her wedding party, the couple she'd introduced as her work mentors who'd helped her land her recent promotion. All of them nodding in agreement, as if dismissing a 58-year-old woman as worthless was not only acceptable, but admirable. I mean, no offense, Mrs. Richardson, Jessica continued, turning to me with the kind of patronizing smile usually reserved for small children and the mentally impaired. It's just that some of us believe in contributing to society, you know? Making something of ourselves instead of living off other people's hard work. The work mentors she'd mentioned, an attractive couple in their 40s who'd been introduced as David and Sandra Walsh, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I recognized them, of course. I'd hired David as VP of Operations 3 years ago, and Sandra had been running our European division since last spring. They had no idea who I was in this context, seeing only what Jessica wanted them to see. A frumpy middle-aged woman in a department store dress, someone easily dismissed and forgotten. "Jessica, maybe we should—" Brian started weakly, but his fiancée cut him off with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "Oh, Brian, don't be embarrassed. We all know your mom is— well, she is what she is. The important thing is that you're nothing like her. You have ambition, drive, potential." She leaned over and kissed his cheek, leaving a perfect lipstick print that looked like a brand of ownership. "That's why I fell in love with you." I caught David's eye across the table. He was studying Jessica with the same expression I'd seen him wear during quarterly reviews when the numbers didn't add up. Sandra, meanwhile, was looking at me with something that might have been sympathy, though she couldn't possibly understand the full scope of what she was witnessing. "Tell them about your new position, Jess," urged her father, a man whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the fact that he'd clearly never missed a meal. "My daughter just got promoted to regional director at one of the biggest tech companies in the city. Techno Global Corp. You know, the one that's been in all the business magazines. Techno Global Corp. My company. The company I'd built from a small software startup 22 years ago, working 18-hour days and sleeping on office couches while Brian was in elementary school. The company that now employed over 12,000 people across 6 countries and had just been valued at $4 billion. Regional director? Jessica preened, clearly savoring the moment. "I'll be overseeing the entire Northeast Division. It's a huge responsibility, but I think I'm ready for it." Sandra choked slightly on her wine. "Regional director? But I thought you just started in—" "Marketing coordination, yes," Jessica interrupted smoothly. "But when you have the right qualifications and connections, advancement comes quickly. I have an MBA from Wharton, 5 years of experience at Goldman Sachs, and excellent references from my previous consulting work." Every word was a lie. I knew because I'd personally reviewed her employment file after Brian had mentioned she'd gotten a job at my company. Jessica had a bachelor's degree in communications from a state school, no MBA from anywhere, and her previous work experience consisted of 2 years as a receptionist at a small accounting firm. She'd been hired as a junior marketing assistant 6 months ago, and her supervisor had already flagged concerns about her work quality and attitude. "That's incredible," gushed Brittany. "And Brian, you must be so proud to be marrying someone so accomplished." "I am," Brian said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at me with an expression I'd seen too often lately, a mixture of guilt and justification, as if he were trying to convince himself that abandoning his mother was a necessary step in his own evolution. "It's funny. David said slowly, his tone carefully neutral. I don't recall approving any promotions to regional director recently. In fact, I'm pretty sure those positions require board approval. Jessica's smile flickered for just a moment, before returning at full wattage. Well, it's not official yet, of course, but my supervisor hinted very strongly that it's in the works. Apparently, I've made quite an impression on the executive team. Have you now? Sandra murmured, taking another sip of wine while studying Jessica with the kind of forensic attention she usually reserved for budget discrepancies. The conversation moved on to wedding plans and honeymoon destinations, but I found myself watching the dynamics at the table with the analytical mind that had served me well in boardrooms and negotiations. Jessica held court like a small-town queen, basking in the attention and approval of people who clearly saw her as their ticket to a higher social stratum. Her parents hung on every word she spoke about her important career and influential connections. Brian sat beside her like an accessory, occasionally offering weak smiles, but contributing little to the conversation. And I sat at the end of the table like a piece of furniture no one particularly wanted, but couldn't quite figure out how to discard. So, what do you do with your time, Mrs. Richardson? Asked Jessica's mother, a woman whose face had been pulled so tight by cosmetic surgery that she looked perpetually surprised. I mean, since you don't work or anything. I read, I said quietly. I volunteer. I spend time in my garden. How quaint, she replied with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. I suppose everyone needs hobbies to fill the time. Hobbies. As if the hours I spent reviewing quarterly reports, attending board meetings, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees were somehow equivalent to collecting stamps or needlepoint. Mom's actually very smart, Brian said suddenly, and for a moment my heart lifted. She reads all sorts of complicated books, business journals, that kind of thing. She just never did anything with it. Never did anything with it. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died when he was 8, the young man I'd put through college and graduate school, the adult who lived in a condo I'd quietly purchased and whose car payments I'd been covering for the past 3 years, and realized that he genuinely believed what he was saying. Brian had no idea what I actually did for a living. In his mind, I was exactly what Jessica had described, a kept woman who'd somehow managed to support them both through the mysterious mechanisms of dead husband's life insurance and careful budgeting. I'd worked so hard to keep my professional life separate from my personal life, to protect him from the gold diggers and social climbers who inevitably appeared when people learned about my wealth. I'd wanted him to be loved for who he was, not what his mother could provide. Looking at Jessica's calculating eyes and Brian's embarrassed posture, I realized my strategy had backfired spectacularly. Well, Jessica said, raising her wine glass in a mock toast, here's to family. Even the ones who don't quite fit the mold we'd choose for ourselves. The table laughed again, that same cruel sound that would echo in my memory for years to come. But this time, I noticed something else. David and Sandra weren't laughing. They were watching Jessica with the kind of professional interest that usually preceded very uncomfortable conversations about job performance and career prospects. I smiled and raised my own glass, meeting Jessica's eyes across the table. To family, I agreed. And to the interesting surprises that await us all. Jessica had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, but she was about to find out. The drive home from the restaurant passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the soft hum of my Mercedes engine and Brian's occasional sighs from the passenger seat. He'd asked for a ride after Jessica had left with her friends for some kind of pre-wedding celebration, claiming he was too tired to deal with all that female energy. Female energy. As if cruelty had a gender. Mom, he said finally as we pulled into my driveway, about what Jessica said tonight. What about it? She didn't mean anything by it. She's just protective of what we're building together. Sometimes she gets a little intense when she feels like our relationship is being threatened. I turned off the engine and looked at my son in the amber glow of the streetlights. At 32, Brian was still handsome in the soft way of men who'd never faced real adversity. His features unmarked by the kind of stress that came from making decisions that affected thousands of people, or staying awake nights worrying about quarterly earnings and employee benefits. Brian, in what way is my existence threatening your relationship? It's not your existence exactly. It's just, he ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to explain why he hadn't done his homework or why he'd broken something valuable. Jessica comes from a family where everyone works hard and achieves things. Her parents are both doctors, her brother's a lawyer, she's climbing the corporate ladder, and then there's you. Then there's me. You know what I mean. You've never had a career, never really contributed to society in a meaningful way. Jessica worries that I might inherit that same kind of complacency. I thought about the board meeting I'd attended just that morning, where we'd approved a $30 million expansion into the Asian market, about the employee wellness program I'd implemented last quarter that had reduced turnover by 40%, about the scholarship fund I'd established that had put over 200 underprivileged students through college. Brian, what do you think I do all day? I don't know. Read, I guess. Garden. Go to lunch with other women who don't work. Normal retired person stuff. I'm 58 years old. Most people don't retire at 58. Most people can't afford to retire at 58. You're lucky Dad left you well provided for. Dad, my husband Michael, who died of a heart attack when his construction business was drowning in debt and our savings were gone. The man whose life insurance policy had barely covered the funeral expenses, let alone provided for a comfortable retirement. Brian, do you have any idea how much money your father left us? I don't know the exact amount, but it must have been substantial. I mean, you paid for my education, bought this house, never seemed to worry about money. The life insurance was $25,000. After funeral expenses, I had about $12,000 left. Brian stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. That's not possible. How did you pay for college? How do you afford to live here? How do you think? I don't know. I assumed you had investments or Dad had savings I didn't know about or... Brian, I work. I've always worked. I've been working since you were 8 years old. But you're always home when I call. You never mention a job. You've never... I work from home most days. I travel when necessary, but I've always arranged my schedule around your needs. When you were young, it was school events and soccer practice. Now it's family dinners and occasions like tonight. He was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the slow deliberation of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality were being challenged. What kind of work do you do? I run a business. What kind of business? I thought about the simplest way to explain it, watching his face for signs that he was ready to hear the truth. Technology consulting, software development, corporate solutions, like Jessica's company, Techno Global, something like that. Brian leaned back in his seat, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and what might have been disappointment. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I wanted you to value people for who they are, not what they can provide for you. I wanted you to choose relationships based on character rather than calculation. You didn't trust me. I was protecting you from people who might see you as an opportunity rather than a person. People like Jessica? The question hung between us like smoke. I could see him struggling with it, weighing his loyalty to his fiancée against the growing evidence that her interest in him might be more complex than either of them had admitted. Brian, what did Jessica know about our family finances when you started dating? Nothing specific. I mean, she knew I lived in a nice place and had a decent car, but I never talked about money with her. When did she start asking? She didn't really ask exactly. She just noticed things. The condo, the way I dress, the restaurants I could afford to take her to. She said it was obvious that I came from a good family. And when did she start talking about her career ambitions? Right from the beginning. It was one of the things I liked about her, how driven she was, how clear she was about what she wanted from life. What does she want from life? Brian was quiet for several minutes, staring out the windshield at my house, the modest two-story colonial I'd chosen specifically because it looked ordinary, forgettable, like the home of someone who'd never made waves or attracted unwanted attention. Security, he said finally. She wants to be important, successful, financially secure. She doesn't want to end up like her cousin who married some guy without prospects and now lives in a trailer park. And you represent security to her. I represent potential. She says I have good genes, good upbringing, the foundation for success even if I haven't achieved much yet. Good genes, good upbringing, the foundation for success. Jessica had evaluated my son like livestock at auction, calculating his breeding potential and market value. Brian, do you love her? Of course I love her. Why? The question seemed to surprise him. Why? Because she's beautiful, ambitious, intelligent, because she believes in me, because she sees potential in me that other people have missed. What potential is that? I don't know yet, but Jessica says that with the right partner, the right connections, I could do anything. She has plans for us, for the kind of life we can build together. Plans. I thought about Jessica's confident lies at dinner, her casual cruelty toward me, her fictional promotion to regional director. Whatever plans she had for her life with Brian, they clearly involved stepping on anyone who got in her way, including the mother-in-law she'd already decided was expendable. Son, I want you to be happy, but I also want you to be careful. Careful of what? Of people who love your potential more than they love you. Brian got out of the car without responding, walking toward his own car with the stiff posture of someone who'd received information they didn't know how to process. I watched him drive away, wondering if I'd said too much or too little, if I should have continued protecting him from the truth, or if it was finally time for him to learn that the world was more complicated than he'd been allowed to believe. Inside my house, I poured myself a glass of wine and reviewed the employment file I'd brought home weeks ago. Jessica Morgan's complete personnel record, including the fabricated resume that had somehow made it past our initial screening process. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to handle this situation as Brian's mother or as the CEO of the company his fiancée was actively attempting to defraud. Tonight, I would have to live with the knowledge that my son was about to marry a woman who saw him as a stepping stone and his mother as an obstacle to be removed. Some lessons I was beginning to understand could only be learned the hard way. The next morning, I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Techno Global building, watching Seattle's skyline emerge through the morning fog while reviewing the quarterly reports that had arrived overnight. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, in the building where Jessica worked 3 floors below, completely unaware that the lazy, chubby mother-in-law she'd mocked last night was reading her performance evaluation with growing concern. My assistant, Patricia Young, knocked and entered with her usual efficient smile and the kind of discretion that had made her invaluable over the past 8 years. "Your 10 o'clock is here," she said, setting down a fresh cup of coffee. "David Walsh from Operations, regarding the Henderson account irregularities. Send him in. And Patricia, after this meeting, I'd like you to pull the complete file on Jessica Morgan in marketing. Everything. Hiring records, background checks, performance reviews, the works. Any particular reason? Personal interest. She's dating my son." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "I'll have it on your desk within the hour." David Walsh entered, looking like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with an uncomfortable truth. He'd traded his casual restaurant attire for a crisp navy suit, but his face carried the same expression of professional concern I'd noticed when Jessica had been spinning her tales about promotions and qualifications. "Beth, we need to talk about last night." "I was hoping you'd say that. Please sit down." David settled into one of the leather chairs facing my desk, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded me uncomfortably of Brian. "I didn't realize who you were until I got home and Sandra pointed it out. We should have said something at dinner." "Why didn't you?" "Honestly? We were both so shocked by what we were witnessing that we didn't know how to handle it. Jessica's behavior toward you was—" He paused, searching for diplomatically appropriate words. "Appalling?" I was going to say unprofessional, but yes, appalling works. David pulled out a tablet and opened it to what looked like personnel files. "Beth, there are some things about Ms. Morgan that you need to know, both as her potential mother-in-law and as the CEO of the company she's been lying to for 6 months." "I'm listening." "Her resume is fiction. The MBA from Wharton? Doesn't exist. Work experience at Goldman Sachs? Also fictional. Her supervisor in marketing has documented multiple instances of subpar work, missed deadlines, and inappropriate behavior toward colleagues." "What kind of inappropriate behavior?" "Name-dropping connections she doesn't have, promising clients access to executives she's never met, claiming credit for work done by other team members. Last month, she told a potential client that she had a direct line to you and could arrange a personal meeting to discuss their account." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Please tell me you're not about to say she's been using her relationship with Brian to fabricate connections within the company." "I wish I could. Beth, she's been telling people that her fiancé's family has significant influence at Techno Global. She's implied that her upcoming promotion is a foregone conclusion because of family connections. What promotion? Exactly. There is no promotion. Regional director positions require board approval, and no such position has been authorized or filled. But somehow, Jessica seems to believe it's inevitable. I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications of what David was telling me. Jessica wasn't just a social climber. She was actively committing fraud, using her relationship with Brian to create fictional credentials and influence within my company. David, how did she get hired in the first place? Our screening process is usually more thorough. That's part of what concerns me. Her application was flagged by our initial screening for discrepancies, but somehow it got pushed through anyway. I've been trying to trace the approval chain, but the documentation is unclear. Meaning? Meaning someone with authorization overrode the standard hiring protocols. Someone who either didn't do their due diligence or who had reasons to want Jessica hired, despite her questionable qualifications. I thought about this, watching David's expression carefully. In 8 years as CEO, I'd encountered my share of corporate politics and influence peddling, but this felt personal in a way that made my skin crawl. David, I want a full investigation, quietly. Use internal security if necessary, but I want to know exactly how Jessica Morgan got hired, who authorized it, and what she's been telling clients and colleagues about her connection to the company. Already started. I'll have a preliminary report by end of business today. After David left, I sat in my office reviewing Jessica's file, which Patricia had delivered with her usual efficiency. The woman who'd mocked me as lazy and worthless had been systematically lying about everything from her education to her work experience, using her relationship with my son to commit what amounted to corporate fraud. My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. Can we have lunch today? I've been thinking about what you said last night, and I have some questions. I stared at the message for a long moment, wondering how much I should tell him and how much he was ready to hear. The truth about Jessica's behavior at work would devastate him, but protecting him from it would only enable her continued deception. I typed back, "Of course. My office, 12:30? Your office? Mom, where exactly do you work?" I looked out at the Seattle skyline, at the city where I'd built my career and my company, at the world where I was respected and valued for exactly the qualities Jessica had dismissed as worthless. Techno Global Corp, 42nd floor. Ask for Elizabeth Richardson. The response came immediately. That's Jessica's company. Do you work there too? Something like that. I'll explain when you get here. I spent the rest of the morning in meetings, reviewing budgets and strategic plans, making decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. The same activities that Jessica had characterized as laziness, that Brian had dismissed as normal retired person stuff. At 12:15, Patricia buzzed me. Your son is here. He's in the lobby asking for directions to Elizabeth Richardson's office. Security wants to know if they should escort him up. Send him up. And Patricia, when he arrives, I want you to introduce me properly. How would you like me to introduce you? I thought about Jessica's cruel laughter, about Brian's embarrassed silence, about the years I'd spent protecting him from the truth about our circumstances and our capabilities, as exactly who I am. 5 minutes later, Patricia opened my office door and ushered in my son, whose face was already showing signs of confusion and dawning comprehension. Brian Richardson, she said with perfect professional courtesy. I'd like you to meet Elizabeth Richardson, Chief Executive Officer of Techno Global Corporation. Brian stood in my office doorway, looking from Patricia to me to the wall behind my desk, where my degrees and awards were displayed, his expression cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something that looked like panic. Mom? He said weakly. Hello, sweetheart. We need to talk. As Patricia closed the door behind her, leaving us alone in my office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of the city I'd helped shape, I realized that the conversation we were about to have would change everything. Not just Brian's understanding of who his mother was, but his understanding of who his fiancé really was, and what she'd been willing to do to get what she wanted. Some truths, I was learning, had perfect timing. And Jessica Morgan was about to discover that her timing had been catastrophically wrong. Brian stood frozen in the doorway of my office for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, his eyes moving from the mahogany desk to the awards on the walls to the city view that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. When he finally moved, It was to sink into one of the leather chairs facing my desk, like a man whose legs had suddenly stopped working. "You're the CEO," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're actually the CEO of Techno Global." "I am." "For how long?" 22 years. I started the company when you were 10 years old." He stared at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted wings. "You started Techno Global? You built this whole company?" "From a small software consulting firm operating out of our garage, yes. The same garage where you used to play while I worked on proposals and coding projects." "I remember that. I thought you were doing homework or something. Playing computer games." "I was building the foundation of what would become a $4 billion corporation." Brian's face went pale. $4 billion? Give or take a few $100 million, depending on market fluctuations. He was quiet for a long time, processing information that clearly contradicted everything he'd believed about his life, his mother, and his place in the world. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of accusation that I'd been dreading. "You lied to me. For 22 years you let me believe we were just ordinary, middle class, getting by. I protected you. There's a difference. Protected me from what? From people like Jessica." The words hung between us like a live wire. Brian's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" I opened my desk drawer and pulled out Jessica's personnel file, setting it on the desk between us. "Brian, Jessica doesn't just work at this company. She's been lying about her qualifications, fabricating her work experience, and using her relationship with you to commit corporate fraud. That's not possible. Her MBA from Wharton doesn't exist. She never worked at Goldman Sachs. Her previous work experience consists of 2 years as a receptionist. She's been telling clients that she has family connections at Techno Global and can arrange meetings with executives she's never met." Brian's face flushed red. "You're investigating my fiancé?" "I'm investigating an employee who has been lying on company documents and misrepresenting herself to clients. The fact that she's your fiancé is complicated." "Complicated? Mom, this is my life we're talking about, my relationship, my future wife." "Brian, she called me lazy and worthless in front of a table full of people. She's been telling everyone that she's getting promoted to regional director, a position that doesn't exist and hasn't been authorized. Last night at dinner, she lied about every aspect of her professional qualifications. Maybe she was just nervous, meeting new people, trying to make a good impression." I looked at my son, this grown man who was still making excuses for someone who'd publicly humiliated his mother, and felt a deep sadness settle in my chest. 22 years of trying to raise him with good values, and he was still more concerned with protecting his fiancé's feelings than facing uncomfortable truths about her character. "Brian, I want you to watch something." I turned my laptop around so he could see the screen, then opened a video file from our internal security system. "This is from last week's client meeting. Jessica is presenting to the Morrison account." The video showed Jessica in our main conference room, talking to 3 executives from a potential client company. Brian watched as his fiancée gestured confidently toward a presentation that looked professional and polished. "I don't see anything wrong with this," he said. "Listen to what she's saying." I turned up the volume so we could hear Jessica's voice clearly. "Of course, having family connections at the executive level gives me unique insights into how Techno Global operates. My future mother-in-law has significant influence here, which means I can guarantee the kind of access and attention that other account managers can't provide." Brian's mouth fell open. There's more." I fast-forwarded to another part of the recording. "As someone who's essentially guaranteed a promotion to regional director, I can assure you that your account will receive priority treatment at the highest levels of the organization." "Oh, God." "Brian, she's been selling access to me, to meetings I've never agreed to, for accounts I've never reviewed, based on influence she doesn't have, and promotions that don't exist." My son put his head in his hands, and for a moment he looked exactly like he had as a child when he'd realized he was in trouble for something he couldn't talk his way out of. "How long have you known?" "I've suspected something was wrong since her background check came back with irregularities 6 months ago. I confirmed it yesterday after dinner." 6 months? His head snapped up. "You've known about this for 6 months and you didn't tell me?" I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that the woman my son was planning to marry wasn't actively lying to my company and using our family name to commit fraud. Our family name? Brian, do you understand what this means? Jessica has been telling people that she has connections to the CEO of Techno Global through family relationships. She's been implying that marrying into our family will advance her career. She's been treating you like a business acquisition. The color drained from his face completely. You can't know that for certain. Actually, I can. I pulled out another file, this one thicker and marked with the Techno-Global Legal Department seal. I had our corporate security team conduct a discreet investigation into her communications and activities. Brian, Jessica has been researching our family's financial situation for months. She knows about the house, the investments, even details about my compensation package. How is that possible? Public records, mostly. CEO salaries are disclosed in annual reports. Property records are available through county databases. Stock holdings can be tracked through SEC filings. Jessica has been very thorough in her research. Brian stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Why would she research our finances? Because she's been planning this relationship like a business transaction. The devoted girlfriend act, the career ambitions, the way she talks about your potential. It's all been calculated to position herself for maximum financial and professional benefit. You're saying she doesn't love me. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and protected, and tried to prepare for a world that was more complicated than either of us had wanted it to be, and wished I could spare him the answer to his question. I'm saying that Jessica loves what you represent, access to wealth, social status, professional connections. Whether she loves you, I paused, choosing my words carefully. I think that's something you need to determine for yourself. Brian was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the city below. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, more uncertain than I'd heard it in years. What happens now? Now you have to decide what kind of man you want to be, and what kind of woman you want to marry. And Jessica? What happens to her? I thought about the investigation David was conducting, about the fraudulent resume and the fake credentials and the clients who'd been promised access they would never receive. That depends on what our investigation reveals and whether she's committed fireable offenses. But Brian, regardless of what happens professionally, you need to understand that Jessica has been lying to you about fundamental aspects of who she is and what she wants from your relationship. The wedding is in 6 weeks. I know. All the deposits have been paid. The invitations have been sent. Everyone's expecting you to marry someone you thought you knew. But Brian, do you actually know Jessica? Or do you know the character she's been playing? My son sat in my office, surrounded by the evidence of a success he'd never known his mother had achieved, processing the revelation that his fiancée had been systematically lying to him about everything from her education to her feelings about his family. Outside my windows, Seattle hummed with the energy of people pursuing their ambitions and dreams, most of them unaware that 42 floors above them, a mother was watching her son discover that love and deception could wear identical masks. And somewhere 3 floors below, Jessica Morgan was probably planning her next move in a game she didn't yet know she'd already lost. Brian left my office in a daze, clutching the elevator handrail like a man who'd forgotten how to trust solid ground. I watched the numbers descend on the display screen, knowing he was heading down to the 39th floor, Jessica's floor, and wondering if he would confront her immediately or spend days wrestling with what he'd learned. I didn't have to wonder long. At 2:47 p.m., Patricia buzzed me with barely concealed excitement in her voice. You need to see this. Security camera feed from the 39th floor break room. She sent the video link to my computer, and I watched my son corner Jessica by the coffee machine, his posture rigid with the kind of controlled fury that reminded me uncomfortably of his father during their worst arguments. Even without audio, I could see the conversation escalating, Brian's gesticulations becoming more animated, Jessica's face cycling from confusion to defensiveness to something that looked like panic. Then Jessica's expression changed completely. She stepped closer to Brian, placed her hand on his chest, and began speaking with the kind of urgent intensity that suggested she was deploying her most persuasive ammunition. Whatever she was saying, it was working. Brian's posture softened, his anger visibly deflating. My phone rang 5 minutes later. Mom? Brian's voice was strained but determined. I talked to Jessica. There's an explanation for everything. I'm sure there is. She said the resume discrepancies were from a temp agency that padded her background without her knowledge. She's been trying to correct the records, but HR processes are slow. The client meeting you showed me, she was just trying to sound confident and professional. She didn't mean to imply anything inappropriate about family connections. I closed my eyes, recognizing the tone of someone who desperately wanted to believe a comforting lie rather than face a devastating truth. Brian, and the financial research you mentioned? She said she was just trying to understand our family better, to make sure she fit in. She comes from a successful family, and she wanted to be sure she could contribute appropriately to family discussions about business and investments. Financial research and background investigations are very different things. Mom, Jessica was in tears. She's terrified that you're going to fire her over misunderstandings. She loves me. She loves our family. And she's afraid that professional complications are going to destroy our relationship. I listened to my son repeat Jessica's explanations with the desperate conviction of someone who needed them to be true, and realized that no amount of evidence would convince him until he was ready to see it. Some lessons could only be learned through experience. Brian, what did you tell her about my position at the company? I told her the truth, that you're the CEO, that you built Techno Global from nothing, that our family situation is more complicated than either of us realized. How did she react? She was shocked, obviously. She had no idea about your professional accomplishments. She feels terrible about what she said at dinner, about not realizing who you really are. I see. Mom, she wants to apologize, to make things right. She's planning to come see you this afternoon to explain everything personally. I looked at my calendar, thinking about the investigation David was conducting, about the false credentials and fabricated connections that couldn't be explained away by temp agency errors or innocent misunderstandings. Tell Jessica I'll see her at 4 o'clock. Thank you, Mom. This means everything to me. After Brian hung up, I called David to discuss what he'd learned about Jessica's hiring process and her activities within the company. His report painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond the misunderstandings she was claiming. Beth, she didn't just lie about her credentials. She forged letters of recommendation from people who don't exist at companies where she never worked. The financial research wasn't casual curiosity. She hired a private investigator to compile detailed information about your assets, property holdings, and business relationships. A private investigator? Professional grade background check. The kind of thing you'd do if you were planning a merger or acquisition. She knows more about your financial situation than most of your board members do. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. David, how long ago did she commission this investigation? The invoices date back 14 months. She was researching your family before she started dating Brian. 14 months. Jessica had been planning her relationship with my son since before their first date, treating courtship like corporate espionage and marriage like a business acquisition. At exactly 4 o'clock, Patricia announced that Jessica had arrived. She entered my office transformed. Gone was the confident, mocking woman from dinner, replaced by someone who projected vulnerability and sincere remorse. Her designer clothes had been swapped for a modest blue dress. Her makeup was subtly applied to suggest she'd been crying, and her posture radiated the kind of humble contrition that might have been convincing if I hadn't seen the security footage of her confident performance with Brian just hours earlier. "Mrs. Richardson," she began, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion, "I cannot tell you how mortified I am about last night. I had no idea who you are, what you've accomplished, what an incredible woman raised the man I love. Please, sit down." She settled into the chair Brian had occupied that morning, arranging herself with the unconscious grace of someone who knew how to use physical presence as a tool of persuasion. "I want to explain about the resume issues. When I started job hunting last year, I used a placement agency that said they would optimize my background for the positions I was seeking. I didn't realize they were actually fabricating credentials until I started working here and had to provide documentation for my employee file." "Which placement agency?" "Elite Professional Services. They're based in Portland, I think. I've been trying to contact them to get the situation corrected, but they seem to have gone out of business." I made a note to have David verify the existence of Elite Professional Services, though I suspected the search would prove fruitless. "Jessica, I understand you've been telling clients that you have family connections within Techno Global's executive structure. That was a terrible misunderstanding. I was trying to sound confident and knowledgeable during client presentations, and I may have overstated my familiarity with company operations. I never intended to imply that I had inappropriate access or influence. But you did imply it, specifically. I realize that now, and I'm deeply sorry. I'm still learning professional protocols, and I clearly overstepped. It won't happen again. I studied Jessica's face, noting the way she maintained eye contact while delivering explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but crumbled under scrutiny. She was good, very good at this kind of performance. No wonder Brian had been convinced. Jessica, tell me about your relationship with my son. When did you first learn about our family's financial situation? I didn't know anything specific until today. I mean, Brian lives well, drives a nice car, takes me to good restaurants, so I assumed his family was comfortable. But I had no idea about the extent of your business success. You never researched our family background? Her pause was barely perceptible, but I caught it, the moment when she calculated whether to continue lying or acknowledge what she knew I might have discovered. I may have looked up some public information, she admitted. Nothing invasive, just the kind of basic research anyone might do when they're serious about someone. Property records, that sort of thing. I wanted to understand what kind of family I might be marrying into. What did you find in your research? That you own a beautiful home, that Brian comes from a stable background. Nothing more than that. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a copy of the private investigator's report David had obtained. 47 pages of detailed financial analysis, property records, business relationships, and personal information that went far beyond casual curiosity. Jessica, this is a professional background investigation commissioned by you and paid for with your personal credit card. It includes details about my compensation, stock holdings, board memberships, and personal relationships. This isn't casual research. This is corporate-level intelligence gathering. Her face went pale, but her voice remained steady. I don't understand what that is. I never commissioned any investigation. The credit card records show payments to Morrison Investigative Services over a period of 6 months. The invoices are addressed to your apartment. Someone must have stolen my identity, used my credit card fraudulently. I'll need to file a police report immediately. I watched Jessica weave increasingly elaborate explanations for evidence that clearly contradicted her claims and realized that she would continue lying until the consequences made denial impossible. Jessica, I'm going to be direct with you. Our security investigation has uncovered systematic deception regarding your credentials, your work performance, and your intentions regarding our family. Tomorrow morning, Human Resources will be conducting a formal review of your employment status. Mrs. Richardson, please. I love Brian more than anything in the world. Yes, I made mistakes, but they came from inexperience and poor judgment, not malicious intent. Don't let professional misunderstandings destroy our family. Our family. As if she'd already secured her position and was now defending territory she considered rightfully hers. Jessica, the evidence suggests you've been planning your relationship with Brian as a strategic business decision. That's not love, that's calculation. You're wrong. I love Brian for who he is, not what his family can provide. I looked at this young woman who'd researched my finances before their first date, lied about her credentials to get a job at my company, and mocked me as lazy and worthless just 24 hours ago, and realized that she genuinely believed her own performance. I hope that's true, I said finally, because tomorrow you're going to discover what Brian is like when he doesn't have his mother's resources to fall back on. Jessica left my office with the same composed dignity she'd brought to the meeting, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes as she processed this new development. She thought she was playing chess with an amateur. She was about to learn that she'd challenged a grandmaster. The Human Resources meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp the next morning in the sterile conference room on the 38th floor that I'd deliberately chosen for its lack of windows, no view to distract from the uncomfortable business at hand. Jessica arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a lawyer she'd somehow managed to retain overnight, a thin man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Richard Sterling from Barrett and Associates. Ms. Morgan, said Jennifer Martinez, our head of human resources, consulting the thick folder spread before her. We're here to discuss several serious concerns regarding your employment with Techno Global Corporation. I sat at the far end of the table, officially present as CEO, but maintaining the professional distance necessary for what was about to unfold. David Walsh sat beside Jennifer, his expression grave as he prepared to present the findings of our investigation. Before we begin, Sterling interrupted, I want it on record that my client contests any allegations of wrongdoing and maintains that any discrepancies in her employment records stem from errors by third-party agencies. Noted, Jennifer replied coolly. David, please present your findings. David opened his laptop and projected a timeline onto the conference room screen. Ms. Morgan's employment application, submitted 6 months ago, contains multiple falsified credentials. The MBA from Wharton Business School, the registrar's office, confirms no record of Jessica Morgan ever enrolling, much less graduating. Jessica's lawyer leaned forward. As we've explained, those credentials were added by a placement agency without my client's knowledge or consent. Elite Professional Services? David asked. We contacted the Portland Better Business Bureau, the Oregon Secretary of State, and the IRS. No business by that name has ever been registered, licensed, or filed taxes in Oregon or any other state. Sterling's confident expression flickered. It's possible the agency operated under a different legal name. Mr. Sterling, Jennifer interrupted. We also investigated the letters of recommendation included in Ms. Morgan's file. The signatures are forged, and the supposed references from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey & Company don't exist as employees or former employees of those firms. I watched Jessica's face carefully as the evidence mounted. She maintained her composed mask, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes, weighing lies against exposure, considering which story might still save her position. Furthermore, David continued, our review of Ms. Morgan's client interactions reveals multiple instances of misrepresentation. She has promised clients access to senior executives without authorization, claimed authority to make decisions beyond her job scope, and explicitly stated that family connections guarantee her professional advancement. The Morrison account meeting, Jennifer added, pulling up another screen, where Ms. Morgan specifically told clients that her future mother-in-law has significant influence at Techno Global and could guarantee access and attention that other account managers can't provide. Sterling turned to Jessica, clearly blindsided by the specificity of the evidence. She leaned over to whisper something urgent in his ear, her composure finally beginning to crack. My client may have overstated her familiarity with company operations, Sterling said carefully. But youthful enthusiasm and poor judgment don't constitute grounds for termination. Actually, they do, Jennifer replied, consulting her manual. Misrepresentation to clients, fraud in employment applications, and abuse of personal relationships for professional gain all violate our corporate code of conduct and constitute immediate grounds for dismissal. Wait, Jessica said, speaking directly for the first time since the meeting began. This is all because of what happened at dinner, isn't it? Because I didn't know who Mrs. Richardson really was? The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see everyone at the table processing the implication that this was personal vendetta rather than professional consequence. Ms. Morgan, I said quietly, your employment review was initiated before our dinner. The investigation into your credentials began 6 months ago when your background check revealed inconsistencies. What happened at dinner simply accelerated our timeline. But you're Brian's mother. This is a conflict of interest. You can't make employment decisions about your son's fiancé. Actually, I can, Jennifer interjected. As CEO, Mrs. Richardson has ultimate authority over all personnel decisions. However, this review has been conducted by the Human Resources Department according to standard corporate protocols. David pulled up another document. Ms. Morgan, we also need to discuss the private investigation you commissioned regarding Mrs. Richardson's financial situation. Morrison Investigative Services provided us with copies of their invoices and reports at your request. I told you that must have been credit card fraud. The investigator confirmed multiple phone conversations with you regarding the scope and details of the investigation. They have recordings. Sterling looked like a man who was rapidly running out of legal strategies. My client invokes her right to remain silent regarding any questions about... This isn't a criminal proceeding, Jennifer said. It's an employment review. Ms. Morgan, do you have any explanation for commissioning a detailed financial investigation of a company executive's personal assets? Jessica was quiet for a long moment, her mask finally slipping to reveal something desperate and calculating underneath. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of defiance I hadn't heard before. I was protecting myself, she said. Brian comes from money. That was obvious from how he lived, what he could afford. I needed to know what I was getting into, what kind of family dynamics I might be dealing with. Rich families can be complicated. So you hired a professional investigator to research your boyfriend's family finances? I hired someone to help me understand what I was getting involved with. That's not illegal. No, but it's certainly calculating, David observed. Ms. Morgan, according to the investigation timeline, you commissioned this report before your third date with Brian Richardson. You were researching his family's wealth while you were still getting to know him as a person. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Jessica hadn't just planned their relationship. She'd been evaluating Brian as a financial opportunity from the very beginning. That's not how it was, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. I wanted to be prepared. Prepared for what? Jennifer asked. For a serious relationship with someone from a different background than mine. Ms. Morgan, I said, leaning forward slightly. The investigation you commissioned included details about my business relationships, board memberships, and personal assets that would only be relevant if you were planning to leverage that information for professional or financial gain. That's not true. The report specifically identifies techno-global executives and board members, along with recommendations for how to approach them for networking opportunities. It reads like a strategic business plan, not casual family research. Sterling whispered urgently to Jessica, who shook her head sharply before turning back to face the table. Fine, she said, her composure finally breaking completely. Yes, I researched Brian's family. Yes, I saw opportunities for professional advancement. But that doesn't mean I don't love him. It doesn't mean our relationship is fake. Ms. Morgan, Jennifer said gently, you applied for a position at Techno Global 2 weeks after commissioning the investigation into the CEO's family finances. You began dating the CEO's son 1 week after that. The timeline suggests a coordinated strategy. You can't prove that. Actually, David said, opening another file, we can. Your initial contact with Brian was through a professional networking event where you specifically sought an introduction to him after learning he was Elizabeth Richardson's son. 3 witnesses confirm that you asked multiple people to facilitate that introduction. The conference room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Seattle traffic 40 floors below. Jessica sat surrounded by evidence of systematic deception, her lawyer looking increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of her planning became clear. Ms. Morgan, Jennifer said finally, Techno Global Corporation is terminating your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you to your office to collect personal belongings, and your access cards and accounts will be disabled within the hour. You can't do this, Jessica said, her voice rising. I'll file a wrongful termination suit. I'll claim discrimination, conflict of interest. You're welcome to pursue legal action, Jennifer replied calmly. However, our legal department is confident that the evidence of fraudulent credentials and client misrepresentation provides clear justification for immediate dismissal. As security arrived to escort Jessica from the building, she turned to look at me one final time, her expression a mixture of fury and something that might have been genuine regret. Brian will never forgive you for this, she said. You've destroyed his happiness to protect your corporate interests. I watched my son's fiancée being escorted from my building, carrying a box of personal items and the ruins of whatever future she'd been planning, and wondered if she was right about Brian's reaction. But somewhere beneath the sadness, I felt something else. Relief that the truth was finally exposed, whatever the cost might be. Some lessons I was learning could only be taught through consequences. And Jessica Morgan had just received an education in the difference between opportunity and entitlement. The phone call came at 6:17 p.m. while I was reviewing quarterly projections in my home office, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of books and family photographs that suddenly felt like artifacts from a simpler time. How could you? Brian's voice crackled through the speaker, raw with anger and something deeper. Betrayal, perhaps, or the particular pain that comes from discovering your mother is capable of destroying your happiness with corporate efficiency. Brian, don't try to explain this away or justify it. You fired the woman I love because she didn't know who you were at dinner. You destroyed her career, her reputation, her future, all because your feelings got hurt. I set down my pen and looked out at the garden where I'd spent countless evenings planning strategy and considering consequences. The same garden where Brian had played as a child while I worked on the business proposals that would eventually become Techno Global. Son, the investigation into Jessica's employment began months before our dinner. The evidence of fraud in her application, the falsified credentials, the client misrepresentations, None of that had anything to do with how she treated me personally. Bullshit. You could have handled this quietly, could have given her a chance to correct the mistakes. Instead, you humiliated her publicly and had her escorted out by security like a criminal. Brian, she wasn't making mistakes. She was committing systematic fraud, based on a resume that was padded by an agency she hired, based on client conversations where she was trying to sound confident and professional. You turned innocent errors into career-ending offenses because she didn't show you proper respect. I heard the echo of Jessica's voice in his words, the same explanations and justifications she'd deployed in my office, and realized she'd spent the afternoon crafting a narrative that positioned her as victim rather than perpetrator. What did Jessica tell you about the private investigator? What private investigator? The one she hired to research our family's finances. The one who provided her with detailed reports about my assets, business relationships, and personal information. The one she paid for over 6 months, starting before your third date. There was silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Brian finally spoke, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. She didn't mention anything about an investigator. Brian, Jessica commissioned a 47-page background investigation into our family's wealth and business connections. She was researching your market value before she decided whether to continue dating you. That's not possible. I have the invoices. The investigator confirmed multiple phone conversations with her about the scope and details of the research. She knew more about my financial situation than most of my board members. Maybe she was just trying to understand what she was getting into. Rich families can be complicated, and she wanted to be prepared. I heard the desperation in his voice, the need to find innocent explanations for evidence that pointed toward calculated manipulation. Brian, the investigation included specific recommendations for how to approach techno-global executives for networking opportunities. It identified board members and their personal interests, along with strategies for leveraging family connections for professional advancement. This wasn't casual research. It was corporate intelligence gathering. You're making it sound worse than it was. I'm telling you exactly what it was. Jessica planned your relationship like a business acquisition. She researched our family's assets, identified professional opportunities, and pursued you as a strategic investment. She loves me. She loves what you represent. Access to wealth, social status, professional connections. Brian, she applied for a job at my company 2 weeks after commissioning the investigation into our family. She sought an introduction to you at a networking event after learning you were my son. Multiple witnesses confirm that she specifically asked people to facilitate that meeting. The silence stretched longer this time, and I could hear the sound of traffic in the background, suggesting Brian was driving somewhere, processing information that contradicted everything he'd believed about his relationship. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To see Jessica. To get her side of this." "Brian, wait. Before you see her, there's something else you need to know." "What now?" I hesitated, knowing that what I was about to tell him would either open his eyes or drive him further into denial. "The timeline, son. Jessica began researching our family 14 months ago. She applied for the techno-global position 13 months ago. She sought an introduction to you 12 months ago. Your first date was 11 months ago. So, Brian, Jessica was planning your relationship for a full month before you ever met. She knew who you were, who I was, what our family represented financially and professionally. When you thought you were meeting someone at random, she was executing a carefully planned strategy to get close to you. She wouldn't. The evidence is documented, son. Timeline, invoices, witness statements. Jessica didn't fall in love with you and then discover your family had money. She identified you as a target because your family had money, then executed a plan to make you fall in love with her. The phone was quiet for so long, I thought Brian had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "How long have you known?" "I've suspected something was wrong since her background check came back with inconsistencies 6 months ago. I confirmed the full scope yesterday after our conversation about her behavior at dinner. And you didn't tell me. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped the woman my son was planning to marry wasn't systematically lying to both of us. But she was. Yes." I heard Brian take a shaky breath, the sound of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality were crumbling in real time. "Mom, what am I supposed to do now? The wedding is in 5 weeks. Everyone's expecting. I've told everyone how happy I am, how perfect she is, how lucky I am to have found someone who loves me for who I am. Brian, except she doesn't love me for who I am, does she? She loves me for what I can provide, for what our family can provide. I'm not a person to her. I'm a business opportunity. I felt my heart break for my son. This man who'd been so eager to believe someone valued him that he'd ignored every red flag along the way. Son, you are worthy of being loved for who you are. But Jessica isn't capable of that kind of love. She's capable of calculation, manipulation, strategic planning, but not the kind of authentic connection that makes a marriage work. How could I not see it? How could I be so blind? Because you trusted someone you thought cared about you. Because you wanted to believe the best about someone you were planning to spend your life with. That's not blindness, Brian. That's hope. And hope isn't something to be ashamed of. But it makes me an idiot. It makes you human. And it makes you someone who's capable of real love, even if Jessica wasn't worthy of it. Brian was quiet for several minutes, and I could hear the sound of a car door closing, suggesting he'd arrived at Jessica's apartment. The conversation was about to move from theoretical to immediate, from evidence and analysis to confrontation and consequences. Brian, whatever she tells you tonight, remember that people who truly love you don't research your family's financial situation before deciding whether you're worth dating. They don't lie about their credentials to get jobs at your mother's company. They don't treat your family like obstacles to be managed or assets to be leveraged. I know. I need to hear it from her. I need to look her in the eye and ask her directly if any of this was real. And if it wasn't, then I guess I'm about to learn what it feels like to call off a wedding 5 weeks before the ceremony. As Brian hung up to face the most difficult conversation of his life, I sat in my office thinking about the price of protection, the cost of truth, and the terrible mathematics of love that could be researched and planned, but never authentically manufactured. Some lessons I was learning had to be learned personally, painfully, completely, and my son was about to receive an education in the difference between being loved and being targeted. The wedding invitations might have been sent, but the real ceremony was just beginning, the one where Brian would finally see Jessica clearly enough to choose who he wanted to become. The call came at 11:43 p.m., jarring me from restless sleep. Brian's voice was hollow, drained of the anger that had fueled our earlier conversation. She admitted it, he said without preamble. All of it. I sat up in bed, reaching for the bedside lamp. Are you okay? I don't know. I don't think I know anything anymore. His voice carried the particular exhaustion that comes from having your reality completely reconstructed in the space of a few hours. She didn't even try to deny it once I confronted her with the timeline. What did she say? That she was sorry I found out. Not sorry she did it. Sorry I found out. She said she really did come to love me, that the relationship became real even if it didn't start that way. She said that was what mattered. I closed my eyes, imagining Jessica's performance, her attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her exposed deceptions. Brian, what did you tell her? I told her that you can't build authentic love on a foundation of lies. That if she'd really loved me, she would have told me the truth about how we met, about why she pursued me, about the investigation into our family. He paused, and I heard the sound of traffic, suggesting he was still driving. She said that was naive, that everyone strategizes about relationships, that love is always partly practical. Is that what you believe? I don't know what I believe. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe everyone does research their partner's financial situation before deciding whether to commit. Maybe I'm just too stupid to understand how modern relationships work. Brian, there's a difference between wanting to understand someone's background and conducting a professional investigation into their assets. There's a difference between practical considerations and systematic deception. She said you destroyed her life out of jealousy. That successful career women always resent their sons' romantic partners because they see them as competition for influence and attention. I felt a flash of anger at Jessica's continued manipulation, her attempt to reframe her exposure as someone else's vindictiveness rather than consequences for her own actions. Do you believe that? I don't know. Part of me wonders if you could have handled this differently, if you could have warned me privately instead of having her fired publicly. Brian, Jessica was defrauding my company. She was lying to clients, misrepresenting her credentials, and promising access she couldn't provide. As CEO, I had a legal and ethical obligation to address that behavior regardless of her personal relationship with you. But the timing? The timing was driven by her escalating lies and the potential damage to our client relationships. Son, what would you have wanted me to do? Continue employing someone who was actively lying to our customers while she planned to marry my son. Brian was quiet for several minutes, processing the impossible situation Jessica's deceptions had created. The collision between my responsibilities as his mother and my obligations as CEO of the company she'd been systematically deceiving. Where are you now? I asked. Driving. I needed to get out of there, needed space to think. The apartment feels contaminated somehow, like everything in it might be part of some larger performance I was too stupid to recognize. You're not stupid, Brian. You're trusting. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now, I feel like an idiot who was played by someone much smarter than me. Jessica isn't smarter than you. She's more calculating, more willing to use people for her own benefit. But that's not intelligence. That's pathology. Mom, can I ask you something? About Dad? The question surprised me. Michael had died when Brian was 8, and we rarely discussed him in detail anymore. Of course. Did he know? About your business, your success, the money you were making? I thought about Michael, about our complicated marriage and the cancer that had killed him, just as Techno Global was beginning to show real profit. Your father knew I was building something, but he died before he could see how successful it would become. We'd always planned to be partners in the business, but his illness and death changed everything. So he married you before you were successful. He married me when I was a struggling single mother with a 5-year-old son and big dreams about software development. We built our relationship on shared values and mutual respect, not financial calculations. Jessica said that was a different era, that modern relationships require more strategic thinking, more practical assessment of compatibility. Brian, your father proposed to me when I was living in a studio apartment and driving a 10-year-old car with a broken air conditioner. He didn't research my earning potential or investigate my family's assets. He fell in love with who I was, not what I might become. And that's what you want from me? I want you to be loved completely, honestly, for exactly who you are, not who you might become, not what you can provide, not what connections you represent. You deserve someone who chooses you because being with you makes their life better, not because being with you makes their ambitions more achievable. I thought that's what I had with Jessica. I know you did, and I'm sorry that someone you trusted used that trust against you. Brian was quiet again, and I heard the sound of his car stopping, the engine turning off. I'm in your driveway, he said. Can I come in? I don't want to be alone tonight, and I can't go back to my place knowing she might show up. Of course. 20 minutes later, we sat in my kitchen drinking tea while Brian processed the complete destruction of everything he'd believed about his relationship and his future. He looked older somehow, aged by the recognition that love could be weaponized and trust could be systematically exploited. What happens now? He asked. The wedding venue, the deposits, the guests who've made travel plans. Everyone's expecting a celebration, and instead they're going to get, what? An explanation about how I was too naive to recognize a con artist? They're going to get an example of someone with enough integrity to choose truth over convenience. Brian, calling off this wedding isn't a failure. It's the smartest decision you could make. It doesn't feel smart. It feels humiliating. Today, yes. In 5 years, you'll look back on this as the moment you saved yourself from a lifetime of manipulation. And what about Jessica? What happens to her? I thought about the young woman who'd planned my son's relationship like a corporate merger, who'd lied about everything from her education to her feelings, who'd been escorted from my building that morning, carrying the remnants of whatever future she'd been constructing. Jessica will land on her feet. People like her always do. She'll find another target, another opportunity, another person whose trust she can leverage for her own benefit. You think she's done this before? I think she's very good at it. Too good for this to be her first attempt. Brian slumped in his chair, looking like someone who'd just realized he'd been swimming in much deeper water than he'd understood. Mom, how do I trust my own judgment again? How do I date someone else without wondering if they're researching my financial situation before deciding whether I'm worth their time? It was the question I'd been dreading, the long-term damage that Jessica's deceptions might cause beyond the immediate pain of a canceled wedding. By learning to recognize the difference between someone who asks about your dreams and someone who investigates your assets. By trusting people who are interested in your character rather than your connections. And how do I tell the difference? I looked at my son, this man who'd been targeted and manipulated by someone who'd seen him as a business opportunity rather than a human being, and realized that Jessica's final gift might be the hardest lesson of all. Time, transparency, and the courage to ask direct questions about things that matter. The right person won't need to research your background, Brian. They'll be interested in creating a future with you that's based on who you both are right now. Outside my kitchen windows, Seattle glittered in the darkness, full of people pursuing love and ambition in combinations that ranged from authentic to calculating. Somewhere in that city, Jessica was probably already planning her next move, her next target, her next strategic relationship. But tonight, my son was safe in my kitchen, processing the truth about manipulation disguised as love and beginning the difficult work of rebuilding trust in his own judgment. Some educations I was learning came with a price that felt unbearable in the moment but proved invaluable over time. Brian was about to discover what it meant to be truly free to choose love over strategy. And Jessica was about to learn that some games had consequences that lasted longer than the pleasure of playing them. The wedding venue looked like a crime scene when Brian and I arrived the next morning to handle the cancellation. Elegant chairs arranged in perfect rows, white linens draped with military precision, flowers that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, all of it waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. Jesus, Brian whispered, stopping in the doorway of the reception hall. Looking at all this makes it real. The event coordinator, a woman named Patricia, whose smile had probably survived countless bridezilla meltdowns, approached with her tablet and the kind of professional sympathy reserved for genuine disasters. Mr. Richardson, I received your call this morning, and I have to say, I'm so sorry for whatever circumstances have led to this decision. Thank you, Brian said, his voice still carrying the hollow quality of someone in shock. We need to cancel everything. The ceremony, the reception, the catering, all of it. Of course, I should mention that given the timing, 5 weeks before the event, there will be substantial cancellation fees according to your contract. I watched Brian's face as he calculated the financial impact of Jessica's deceptions, the money that would be lost beyond the emotional devastation she'd caused. How much are we talking about? He asked. Patricia consulted her tablet. The ceremony and reception deposits total $47,000. According to the cancellation clause, you'll forfeit approximately 60% of that amount, nearly $30,000. Money Brian had saved carefully over months, money he'd invested in what he'd thought was the beginning of his life with someone who loved him. I'll cover it, I said quietly. Mom, no. This is my mistake, my responsibility. Brian, this isn't your mistake. This is fraud. And fraud has victims. You're not responsible for the financial consequences of someone else's deceptions. Patricia looked between us with the careful neutrality of someone who'd witnessed family dynamics in crisis before. If I may suggest, we can work with you on the timeline for payments, and there are some elements of the contract that might be negotiable given the circumstances. Why, what do you mean? I asked. Well, without going into detail, cancellations due to discovered fraud or misrepresentation sometimes fall under different contractual provisions. If you're willing to provide documentation of the circumstances, we might be able to minimize the financial impact. I thought about the investigation files, the employment termination records, the timeline of Jessica's systematic deceptions that had led to this moment. We can provide documentation. An hour later, we'd reduced the cancellation penalties by 2/3 and arranged for the return of most deposits, a small victory in the larger catastrophe of Brian's cancelled future. What about the guests? Brian asked as we walked back to my car. People have made travel arrangements, bought gifts, requested time off work. How do I explain to everyone that the woman I've been talking about for months turned out to be a complete fabrication? You tell them the truth, that you discovered information about your fiancé that made marriage impossible. The truth? The truth is that I was too naive to recognize a con artist. The truth is that I fell in love with someone who was researching my family's bank account before our third date. Brian, the truth is that someone targeted you systematically and professionally. That's not a failure of judgment on your part. That's criminal behavior on hers. We drove in silence through Seattle's morning traffic, both of us processing the magnitude of what we were dismantling. A year of relationship, months of wedding planning, a future that had seemed certain just 48 hours ago. Mom, can I ask you something about your work? Of course. Do you ever feel guilty about having money? About the advantages it creates? The way it changes how people see you? I thought about the question, remembering my own journey from struggling single mother to successful CEO, the gradual recognition that wealth brought both opportunities and complications. I feel responsible for using it wisely. Money is a tool, Brian. It can be used to help or harm, to build or destroy. Jessica saw our family's wealth as something to exploit. I try to see it as something to steward responsibly. But doesn't it make relationships complicated? How do you know if people like you for yourself or for what you can provide? By being careful about who you trust with the information. By building relationships slowly, based on shared values and genuine compatibility. By watching how people treat others who can't benefit them. Like how Jessica treated you at dinner? Exactly. When someone shows you contempt for people they consider beneath them, they're showing you who they really are. Jessica's cruelty toward me wasn't about not knowing my position, it was about her character. Brian nodded slowly, processing this perspective. I keep thinking about things she said, things I dismissed at the time. Comments about your appearance, your lifestyle, your lack of ambition. I thought she was just direct. She was establishing dominance, making it clear that she saw herself as superior to your family, that marrying you would be charity work on her part. God, how did I not see it? Because you're not cruel, Brian. Because it doesn't occur to you to treat people that way, so you didn't recognize it as a strategy. We pulled into my driveway, and I could see Patricia's car in my garage. My assistant had agreed to help us manage the logistics of unwinding a wedding that had been built on systematic deception. Beth? Patricia called from the kitchen as we entered. I've contacted the caterer, the florist, and the photographer. Most of them are being understanding about the circumstances, especially with the documentation we provided. Thank you. What about the gifts? That's more complicated. Many guests have already sent presents. Technically, engagement gifts should be returned, but wedding gifts are more of a gray area. Brian sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the practical complexities of untangling Jessica's elaborate deceptions. Return everything, he said. All of it. I don't want anything that was given based on lies about what kind of person I was marrying. Brian, that's going to be a massive undertaking, Patricia warned. We're talking about probably 100 gifts from family and friends. I don't care. Jessica accepted those gifts under false pretenses. The least I can do is make sure people get their money back. I watched my son make this decision with something approaching pride. Even in the midst of personal devastation, he was choosing integrity over convenience. There's one more thing, Patricia said hesitantly. Jessica called the office this morning. Several times. She wants to speak with you about working together to minimize the damage from what she's calling a misunderstanding. Brian's face darkened. She's still trying to manage the narrative. What did you tell her? I asked. That all communication should go through our legal department. But Beth, she seemed very confident that she could convince Brian to reconsider. She kept saying that people make mistakes, that love means forgiveness, that throwing away a relationship over business complications was destructive to everyone involved. Business complications, Brian repeated. She's calling fraud and systematic deception business complications. Jessica has spent months crafting a version of reality that serves her interests, I said. She's not going to abandon that narrative just because it's been exposed. She'll keep trying to convince you that the problem is everyone else's overreaction, not her behavior. Well, she's going to be disappointed. I've seen enough evidence to understand exactly who she is and what she was doing. Brian looked around my kitchen, at the home where I'd raised him while building the company Jessica had tried to exploit. Mom, I owe you an apology. For what? For not defending you at dinner. For being embarrassed by what I thought was your lack of ambition. For being so desperate to believe Jessica loved me that I ignored how she treated the person who raised me. Brian, you don't need to apologize for being hopeful about love. You need to learn from this experience, but you don't need to be ashamed of it. I'm ashamed of my cowardice, of sitting there while she mocked you, while she dismissed your worth in front of people who didn't know any better. And now you know better. Now you understand the difference between someone who deserves your protection and someone who needs your protection from the truth about themselves. Outside my kitchen windows, Seattle was moving through another ordinary day, people pursuing their ambitions and relationships with varying degrees of authenticity. Somewhere in the city, Jessica was probably planning her next move, her next target, her next strategic relationship. But in my kitchen, my son was learning the most valuable lesson I could teach him, that real love required no research, no investigation, no strategic planning. It required only courage, honesty, and the wisdom to choose character over calculation. The wedding might have been canceled, but Brian's education in the true nature of love was just beginning, and this time, he would be the one setting the standards. 2 years later, I stood in the same Techno-Global conference room where we'd terminated Jessica Morgan's employment, but this time, the atmosphere was celebratory rather than confrontational. The quarterly board meeting had just concluded with the announcement of our highest profits in company history, and I was preparing to make an announcement that would surprise everyone present. "Before we adjourn," I said, standing at the head of the polished table where 12 board members sat with their coffee and satisfied expressions, "I have something important to discuss regarding succession planning." The room fell silent with the kind of attention that multi-million-dollar decisions commanded. As many of you know, I've been considering transitioning from active CEO duties to an advisory role. Today, I'm pleased to announce that Brian Richardson has accepted the position of Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately, with a clear path to CEO succession over the next 18 months. David Walsh smiled broadly from his seat at the far end of the table. He'd been instrumental in Brian's development over the past year, mentoring him through the complexities of executive leadership with the patience of someone who understood the difference between nepotism and genuine qualification. Brian has spent the past 2 years learning every aspect of our operations, I continued. He's worked in customer service, software development, sales, and financial planning. His promotion to COO is based entirely on merit and performance, as evaluated by department heads who had no knowledge of his relationship to me during the review process. Sandra Walsh, now our Vice President of Global Operations, raised her hand. "Beth, what prompted this timeline? Brian's development has been impressive, but 18 months seems accelerated." It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting. The board deserved to understand the reasoning behind what might appear to be rapid advancement. "2 reasons," I said, settling back into my chair. First, Brian has demonstrated not just competence, but exceptional judgment under pressure. His handling of the Morrison account crisis last quarter, his leadership during the European expansion, and his development of our employee mentorship programs show he understands both the technical and human aspects of corporate leadership. "And second?" asked Robert Chen, our longest-serving board member. "Second, I want to ensure that when Brian assumes the CEO role, it's clear to everyone, employees, clients, competitors, that he earned the position through his own abilities, not family connections. The best way to do that is through transparent succession planning and documented performance." What I didn't say, but what several board members understood from the investigation files they'd reviewed 2 years ago, was that Brian's experience with Jessica had taught him valuable lessons about authenticity, integrity, and the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. After the meeting, Brian and I walked to my office where the afternoon light painted Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and promise. "Congratulations, COO Richardson," I said, pulling out a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for this moment. "It still feels surreal," Brian admitted, settling into the chair where he'd first learned the truth about Jessica's deceptions. 2 years ago, I thought success meant marrying someone who impressed other people. Now I'm realizing that success means becoming someone who impresses yourself. And what impresses you about yourself these days? The fact that I can recognize authentic relationships now, that I understand the difference between someone who supports my growth and someone who wants to exploit my opportunities. I thought about the changes I'd witnessed in Brian over the past 2 years, the careful way he'd rebuilt his social life, the deliberate process he'd developed for evaluating new relationships, the confidence that came from earning rather than inheriting his professional position. "Speaking of relationships," I said, pouring champagne into 2 glasses, "how are things going with Sarah?" Brian's face lit up with genuine happiness. "Good, really good. She doesn't know about the succession plan yet. I wanted to tell her myself tonight, but I think she'll be excited. Sarah Martinez was a software engineer Brian had met in our company's coding boot camp for women returning to the workforce after career interruptions. She was brilliant, independent, and had no idea about Brian's family connections when they'd first started dating. Their relationship had developed slowly, organically, based on shared interests and mutual respect. "She still doesn't know who I am?" I asked. "She knows you're someone important at Techno Global. My references to my mom in relation to the company made that obvious. But she thinks you're like a department head or senior manager. I've been waiting for the right time to explain the full situation." "And when will that be?" "Tonight, actually. I'm planning to tell her about the promotion, about my path to CEO, and about why I've been so careful about mixing personal and professional relationships." "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Brian admitted. "But not because I'm worried she'll suddenly become interested in my prospects. I'm terrified because I'm in love with her, and I want to make sure our relationship can handle this level of honesty." I felt something warm settle in my chest, pride in Brian's growth, satisfaction in his choices, hope for his future happiness. "Brian, real love doesn't need to be protected from truth. If Sarah is the right person for you, she'll be excited about your success because she cares about your happiness, not because she sees opportunity for herself." I know that intellectually. But after Jessica, you learn to recognize the difference between calculation and caring. Trust that education. We drank our champagne in comfortable silence, looking out at the city where Brian would soon be helping to shape the future of thousands of employees and millions of dollars in economic activity. "Mom, can I ask you something? Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't exposed Jessica's lies? If I'd married her without knowing the truth?" I considered the question, imagining an alternate timeline where Jessica's deceptions had remained hidden, where Brian had built a life with someone who saw him as a business opportunity rather than a beloved partner. I think you would have figured it out eventually. Maybe not immediately, but authentic love and strategic manipulation can't coexist indefinitely. Jessica's true nature would have emerged, probably in more devastating ways than what actually happened. "You think she would have left me once she'd gotten what she wanted?" "I think she would have used you until she found a better opportunity." People like Jessica don't stop calculating, Brian. They just expand their ambitions. Do you know what happened to her after she was fired? Last I heard, she'd moved to New York and was working for a financial consulting firm. David mentioned that she'd married the managing partner's son about 6 months ago. So she found her target after all. She found a target. Whether she found happiness, that's between her and whatever conscience she possesses. As evening settled over Seattle, Brian prepared to leave for his dinner with Sarah, to share news that would change both their professional and personal futures. I watched him check his reflection in my office windows, adjusting his tie with the careful attention of someone who understood that how you presented yourself mattered, but that who you actually were mattered more. "Brian," I called as he reached the door, "remember that the right person will be proud of your success, because they're proud of you, not because your success benefits them, but because your happiness matters to them. Thanks, Mom, for everything. For protecting me from Jessica, for teaching me the difference between love and manipulation, and for giving me the chance to earn my place here rather than just inheriting it." After he left, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation we'd had 2 years ago in this same space when Brian had been devastated by the revelation of Jessica's systematic deceptions. Tonight, he would be sharing authentic good news with someone who'd earned the right to hear it. Some lessons, I reflected, were expensive but invaluable. Brian's experience with Jessica had cost him $30,000 in wedding expenses, months of emotional pain, and the humiliation of publicly canceling a major life event. But it had taught him to recognize authentic love, to value character over calculation, and to understand that real partnership required honesty rather than strategy. Outside my windows, the city glittered with the lights of people pursuing their dreams and ambitions, some authentically, and others with varying degrees of manipulation and deceit. But tonight, my son was having dinner with someone who'd fallen in love with his character rather than his connections, someone who would celebrate his promotion because she celebrated him. I'd learned that the most valuable inheritance I could give my son wasn't money or position. It was the wisdom to recognize the difference between being loved and being targeted. Some people research your assets before they research your heart. Others research your heart and discover that your assets were never what mattered. The difference, I discovered, is everything. The end.
저 안개가 점점 계속 몰려들면서 저 앞에 시야가 점점 안 보이는데 어떻게 하지? 일로 오면 행복하다. 이렇게 아름다운 세상에 살고 있고 탁 트인 바다 앞에 파도 소리랑 대화를 나누고 있는 파도가 부서지는 걸 위서 비가 많이 올 때 일하면 그러다 로딩하면 큰일 나면 어떡해? 안주할 것도 없고 에이씨. 위험한 건 웬간하면 무리하지 마. 무리한 건 하지 말라고 본인도. 이건 어떻게 해 먹어야 될까? 지금 프라이팬도 지금 없고 물에다 데쳐 먹나? 아, 난 햄 같은 거 안 좋아하고 안 먹는데. 냄비는 있어. 냄비에다 구우라고? 아, 젓가락질에 아까 젓가락질에 넣고 구우라고 했지. 그러다 불나면 어떡해. 야, 금방 식네, 금방 식어. 바람 부는 제주에는 돌도 많지만 그 옆에 아저씨 나 때문에 시끄러워서 못 자는 거 아니야? 타투야, 나 술 끊었잖아. 아이고, 이거 하나 펴도 어떻게 듣는 거야? 이거를 굽는 거야. 이렇게. 먹고 살기 힘들다,